You think that red hoodie's gonna shield a black kid from my gun?" The cop's voice was a snarl, sharp and vicious, as he loomed over Jordan. Seconds later, the boy crumpled, blood pooling beneath him like a quiet wound to the soul of justice. With his last breath, he gasped a line from the Civil Rights Act, a final stand before silence claimed him. But then, his father emerged not a broken man, but a Delta Force commander whose very name once made enemies quake. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. When justice wears a color and truth gets crushed under boots, will you stand or look away? In a state where mirrors still show what's right, what would you do? Jordan tied his sneakers with deliberate care, each tug of the laces a small act of defiance, his father's words ringing in his ears. "Don't let them call you sloppy. Don't let them say you're reckless." He inhaled deeply, the morning air heavy with the scent of last night's rain and city grit. In his hand, a paper bag cradled a warm sandwich for his grandma, its savory aroma trailing him like a loyal friend. He tapped out a quick text on my way to Grandma, his thumb steady on the screen. Miles away, in a humming office filled with the soft drone of a morning meeting, Harris felt his phone buzz. A faint smile broke through the whirring etched into his face, his son's message a fleeting promise of safety. Jordan pocketed his phone and scanned the street. The sidewalk unfurled before him, a cracked gray path speckled with glinting bits of glass catching the early sun. He adjusted his backpack strap, smoothed the sandwich bag to keep it perfect, every move careful, intentional, like he was holding his world together with each step. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any confrontation with the HOA. We'll narrate your story on our channel. Carried a quiet grace, an unspoken discipline shaped by years of whispered lessons from his father. Always be deliberate, always be seen as gentle. His head lowered slightly as he stepped forward, each breath steady and intentional, as if each footfall was a quiet hymn only he could hear. Far across the street, Rossi 55 shifted behind the tinted glass of an old patrol car, fingers coiling around the cold metal of his rifle like a snake about to strike. His eyes narrowed through binoculars to cold beads of malice fixing on Jordan's. Slow, careful movements, the officer's lip twitched into a crooked smirk, his breath low and rattling as he whispered to the gun in his hand, the way a man might whisper to a loyal dog before a hunt. "One shot," he muttered under his breath, his voice, a quiet blade, slicing through the empty interior of the car. "One shot to make this whole city bow." Jordan bent slightly, adjusting the bag again. His fingers brushed the waxy surface, the smell of egg and ham rising, a gentle warmth that reminded him of early mornings in his grandmother's kitchen. Steam rising from a pan, her soft humming mixing with the sizzle of oil. The memory clung to him like a second skin, fragile and sacred. He slipped an earbud into his ear, but fumbled, and it fell, bouncing once against his chest before hitting the pavement. The sound seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness. A small sharp crack that laid bare his youth, his softness, his unpreparedness. In the office, Harris felt a sudden tremor inside his chest, an unnameable shift that tugged his focus away from the voices of old comrades sitting around him. He turned sharply to his monitor, checking the small blinking dot that marked Jordan's location. A shadow crossed his face as if an old scar had just been touched. His hand tightened around his pen, his jaw locking, and the room's chatter blurred into a dull hum he could no longer hear. Jordan looked up, brushing off the earbud and slipping it back into his pocket. He adjusted the edge of his hoodie, pulling it a little tighter around his face, a small fortress against the curious, sometimes hostile gaze of the world. He turned for a brief moment, his eyes meeting the dark glass of a nearby security camera. It was only a second, but in that second, his eyes carried something beyond fear, beyond routine caution. It was a silent plea, a flicker of a question hanging in the air like a fragile lantern. Is anyone watching? Does anyone see me? RC-55 licked his dry lips, sweat gathering under his collar despite the coolness of the car. His fingers traced the barrel of the gun slowly as though it were a living thing he cherished, something with breath and heartbeat, something he believed could grant him the power to become more than a man. His smile returned, but now it twisted deeper, stretching across his face like a tear in fabric. His heart pounded in the shadows of his chest, not from fear, but from the electric thrill of control, the raw taste of impending violence. The sandwich bag crinkled softly under Jordan's grip as he stepped forward again, the tiny folds and creases smoothing with each careful motion. He drew in another breath, tasting the city's morning, a bitter-sweet blend of exhaust, bread, and unspoken prayers. Somewhere deep inside him, a small knot tightened, but he kept moving, one step at a time, as if each step was stitched from every lesson he had ever learned about survival and grace. Our C-55 lowered his head closer to the steering wheel, eyes glowing with a feverish hunger. His voice, barely a hiss, slipped through his teeth as he leaned in, lips curling around each poisonous word with cruel delight. "Let's see if you dare to keep breathing until sundown." And for a moment, the whole street seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether a young boy's gentle promise to his grandmother could outlast the sharp breath of hatred stalking him from the shadows. Our C-55 watched the boy move down the sidewalk, his breath slow and measured like a predator savoring the scent before a kill. He stepped out of his patrol car, his boots striking the ground with a confidence that reeked of contempt. Each motion was practiced, almost ritualistic, shaped by years of unchecked power and silent approvals from those above. His badge gleamed under the weak morning sun, but his eyes betrayed a twisted pride that no symbol of law could claim. Deep inside, our C-55 believed in striking first, crushing any hint of resistance before it could find a voice. At that same moment, Harris leaned closer to his screen, eyes narrowing at the blinking dot representing Jordan. The boy had stopped longer than usual. Harris felt something claw at his chest, a silent drum of warning he knew too well from old battlefields. His finger hovered over the call button, tapping once, twice, desperate to hear his son's steady breath, but the signal faltered. A sudden hush on the line that turned Harris's steady hands into fists, trembling with dread. Our C-55 adjusted the small chest camera strapped to his vest. He tilted it slightly, enough to create a blind spot, a practice move that turned accountability into a cheap illusion. As he turned, the sleeve of his uniform lifted, revealing a pale tattoo of a white wolf howling against a dark moon, a mark known only among a secret circle, a brotherhood built on fear and violence. His lips curled as he whispered to himself, each word dripping with venom. "Every black child needs to be reminded who owns this ground." In the office, Harris slammed his palm onto the table, sending pens and papers flying. His old comrades watched in stunned silence as he shot up from his chair, eyes burning with the father's primal fear. He hit redial again, but the line remained dead, the screen's glow as cold and unfailing as a winter night. Harris's chest heaved, his breath coming in short bursts, each inhale laced with the ghost of past failures he had sworn never to repeat. Our C-55 leaned against the car for a moment, his hands sliding across his brow to catch the sweat that stung. His eyes, his fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the electric anticipation coiled in his muscles. He drew in a deep breath, savoring the sharp scent of gun oil and asphalt. To him, this was no mere patrol. It was a sacred ceremony, a chance to reinforce his rule through terror. His grin returned, wide and brittle, spreading across his face like a fresh crack in old glass. He glanced back at the empty street, his days slicing through the morning calm as if peeling skin from bone. Somewhere beyond his vision, Jordan adjusted his hoodie, smoothed the crumpled sandwich bag once more, unaware of the coiled thread only steps away. That small, careful gesture, so innocent and precise, stood in stark defiance against the darkness looming above him. Harris stared at the frozen dot on his screen, his mind a rush of fragmented images. His son's first steps, the laughter echoing in the backyard, Jordan's small hand gripping his finger in a hospital room. He clenched his teeth, each memory a dagger twisted deeper into his resolve. The room around him faded. His colleagues' voices muffled like distant echoes underwater. Only the boy mattered now. Outside, RC5 inhaled deeply again, fingers tightening around the grip of his firearm. Each heartbeat echoed in his skull like a war drum, pushing his thoughts into a single sharp line. Dominate or be forgotten. His thumb brushed the safety switch, a gentle caress meant only for his satisfaction. Like an artist admiring his brush before the first violent stroke of paint. For Harris, the world had narrowed to a single point of light, his son's location. He knew that stillness on the screen meant danger, that silence meant the universe had drawn a blade to his boy's throat. With a final trembling exhale, he grabbed his jacket and charged from the room, the echo of his boots, a broken prayer against the sterile hallway floors. Meanwhile, RC-55's thoughts spiraled, weaving a cruel tapestry of imagined headlines and trembling faces. His mind whispered of crowds kneeling, of silent mothers clutching empty beds, of a city forced to bow beneath his thunder. He flexed his fingers, feeling the cool kiss of the metal, the promise of power humming beneath his skin like an ancient curse he gladly carried. Hurting in his chest, he paused just for a heartbeat to savor the scent of cheap leather, mixed with sweat and old gunpowder inside the car. Then he leaned forward, eyes narrowing to slits, his voice a low snarl spilling out in the language of violence. "One shot," he murmured, his teeth gleaming through the thin slit of his grin. "One shot to make this whole city kneel." In that breathless moment, with all its noise and silence woven together, a question seemed to hang heavy in the air. What is a life worth when weighed against another man's pride? And as RC-55's shadow stretched across the street, the morning sun watched without judgment, leaving the answer for all of us to carry. The echo of RC-55's cruel promise still lingered in the heavy morning air as Jordan slowly turned to face him. His chest rose and fell in tight measured breaths, each inhale a silent prayer to the lessons his father had etched into his bones. He lifted his hands carefully, fingers spread wide in a quiet universal gesture of surrender. Yet in his eyes there was no surrender at all. Instead, there shimmered something delicate and defiant, a glow of spirit that refused to be erased. Jordan swallowed hard, his voice breaking into a whisper that trembled in the space between them. "Stand still, breathe." The words felt like a thin thread connecting him to his father, a lifeline stretching across the miles of asphalt and metal that separated them now. His shoulders shook, but his chin did not lower. His gaze did not drift away. Each second felt like a slow heartbeat, echoing too loudly in his head. RC-55 tilted his head, eyes narrowing as though trying to see past the boy's skin and into his very soul. There was no respect in his stare, only insult, only a sneering fury that grew hotter. With each second, Jordan dared to remain upright. He spat the words with a twisted delight, as if tasting poison he had grown to love. "You dare quote the law to me? I am the law." Far away, Harris gripped the wheel of his vehicle. The sirens wailed, tearing through the early morning like a wounded animal's cry. His heart thundered against his ribs. Each beat a war drum calling him toward his son. He leaned forward over the steering wheel, eyes red and teeth clenched so tight he feared they might shatter. "Wait for me, son," he rasped, his voice swallowed by the wind rushing past his open window. Back on the street, Jordan's knees threatened to give, but he locked them, forcing every ounce of his young strength to hold. The sandwich bag in his hand strained, the thin strings digging into his trembling fingers as if to remind him of his purpose, his promise. A small tear formed along one edge, and he pressed harder to keep it from falling apart, to keep some part of his morning mission intact. The air between them thickened, an invisible wall built of hate and fear, yet also of unspoken love reaching out from a father racing down the highway. Jordan could almost hear his father's voice again, low and patient from countless nights of quiet lessons. "Breathe, son. Always breathe, even when they want you to forget how." RC-55's lips curled into a smirk, his hand hovering near his holster. as though it were an extension of his twisted pride. He scoffed, the sound slicing through the boy's courage like a dull knife, yet failing to draw it out. The man took a step closer, his boots grinding tiny shards of glass underfoot, the crackling sound sharp enough to echo off the silent buildings around them. Jordan felt a shiver crawl along his spine, but he did not move. His lungs burned with each careful breath, his pulse pounding so loudly in his ears, he feared the officer might hear it, too. His eyes darted to the fraying sandwich bag again, to the small thread of egg and cheese that threatened to slip free, as though even the simplest kindnesses he carried could not escape this brutal moment. In the distance, Harris slammed the accelerator to the floor, his entire body coiled like a spring, ready to snap. His mind replayed every moment he had ever watched Jordan take a fall or scrape a knee. Every tiny wound that he had kissed away with promises of safety. Now those promises hung in the air, thin and fragile as a spider's web, waiting to be torn by a single violent gust. Jordan's mouth opened again, voice rough as gravel, but steady in its shape. "I'm not a threat." The words tumbled out, each one carrying the weight of generations, the silent pleas of countless fathers and sons who had stood in the same place, praying for a mercy that too often never came. RC-55 threw his head back, letting out a low, humorless laugh that tasted like rust and old smoke. His fingers twitched at the gun, his muscles tensing, each motion a dark dance that only he seemed to enjoy. "Say one more word," he snarled, his voice scraping against the walls of his rage, "and you'll never call your father again." The boy's eyes fluttered shut for just a heartbeat, his fingers tightening around the bag as though it were a shield, forged from every bedtime story, every shared breakfast, every quiet prayer. He drew in one last breath, the morning air sharp and cold, tasting of exhaust and something bitter, something final. And so he stood, trembling but unbowed, fragile, monument to all that is right and all that should be protected. In that sliver of time, when violence and love collided beneath the gray sky, one question rose silently in the hearts of all who might watch. What is dignity worth when the world demands you surrender it? Jordan's last breath still trembled. In the cold morning air, when our C-55 lunged forward, his hands shoving the boy with a force that felt less like an arrest and more like a wild animal's charge, Jordan's head struck the iron street pole with a sickening thud, the sound echoing down the silent sidewalk like a cruel bell toll. A thin line of blood slipped down from his hairline, tracing a slow, sorrowful path across his cheek. His knees buckled, but his fingers stayed locked around the paper bag, as if that simple package carried the last piece of peace he had left in the world. The white paper darkened where drops of blood fell, each mark blooming like a crimson flower against the delicate surface. It was a quiet tragedy in motion, the purity of a grandson's gift to his grandmother, now tainted by the same violence, meant to control him. Jordan's breath came in ragged gasps, his shoulders trembling under the weight of pain and fear. But still he did not let go. Our C-55 stepped in closer, his shadow swallowing Jordan's slight frame. He leaned forward until their faces were nearly touching, the sour scent of sweat and gun oil clinging to his breath. Jordan's lips parted, words barely escaping, each syllable soft as a prayer. "Please, I did nothing." The officer's eyes gleamed with a cruel satisfaction, his smirk curving up like a blade drawn too close to the skin. He hissed, each word coated in venom and self-righteous loathing. That look that thinks you still have dignity. I hate it the most." Far off, Harris slammed his fist against the steering wheel, his voice ripping out of him, half plea, half command. "Move, move." The siren's wail screamed ahead, slicing through traffic, but it could not reach fast enough to bridge the yawning chasm of seconds stretching between father and son. Jordan's hands trembled, tightening around the bag, his fingernails dug deep into his palms until thin lines of blood welled up, mixing with the sticky warmth already on his fingers. The pain did not deter him. Instead, it became an anchor, a last fragile tether to his sense of self and to the simple act of carrying a meal to someone he loved. RC-55's boot rose slowly. The leather cracked and stained from years of unchallenged power. Then, without hesitation, he brought it down, crushing the sandwich bag beneath his sole. A wet sound cracked through the air as the contents burst outward, smearing yolk and sauce, shreds of bread and blood splattering across his uniform and pooling at his feet. Jordan's eyes widened in horror, his lips parting as if to cry out. But no sound emerged. His whole body shivered as though the coldness of the street had seeped through his bones and replaced his blood with ice. The smell of the ruined sandwich mingled with the sharp iron scent of his blood, creating a nauseating mix that clung to the morning like an unwelcome fog. RC-55 looked down at the mess on his boot, and a wild, almost joyous laugh broke from his throat. It was a sound without humanity, a jagged echo of glee that seemed to feed on the boy's horror and the quiet horror of anyone who might witness such a moment. He ground his heel further into the crushed remains, each movement deliberate, as if savoring the final destruction of something pure and defenseless. Jordan's head fell forward slightly, his breath coming in sharp, painful bursts. His fingers twitched around the remnants of the bag, as though trying to gather the pieces back together, to reverse the moment, to protect what was already lost. His eyes flickered with memories, mornings at the kitchen table, his grandmother's soft laughter, his father's strong guiding hand on his shoulder. Those small fragments flared and faded like dying stars. RC-55 leaned in closer, his face a mask of twisted triumph, his hand now gripping his firearm with a lover's familiarity. He drew it up, the barrel cold and dark, and pressed it against Jordan's forehead. The contact sent a shiver down Jordan's spine, his shoulders jerking involuntarily as though the steel had whispered its cruel promise. The world seemed to hush as if even the birds in the trees held their breath. The weak morning sun shone down, without warmth, casting long accusatory shadows around them. RC-55's lips parted, his voice a ghostly murmur that slipped past Jordan's ears and settled deep into the hollow of his soul. "You want to meet God," he whispered, the words sliding like ice over broken skin. "I can send you there right now." In that final instant, as a thin line of blood trickled down Jordan's face and pulled at his chin, the boy drew in one trembling breath, eyes closing around a memory that no boot could crush and no bullet could erase. And in that fragile silence, a question seemed to hang above them, heavy as the morning sky. What does it mean to be human when all they want is for you to be afraid? The steel barrel pressed cold against Jordan's forehead as his breath came. In weak, uneven gasps, the world around him blurred at the edges, every sound echoing as though heard underwater. His lips trembled, the taste of blood thick on his tongue. He forced his eyes open, lifting them to meet the dark, raging stare above him. Slowly, with the weight of his father's voice echoing in his bones, he whispered, "Fourth Amendment, unreasonable, search and seizure." Each word crawled out of him like a wounded creature, fragile yet defiant. RC-55's eyes widened, the veins along his neck bulging as if they might burst. In those words, the officer heard not plea, but a direct insult, a challenge to everything he believed made him untouchable. His face contorted and a low primal growl rose from deep in his chest, filling the small space between them with an almost uneasy animalistic rage. Far away, Harris gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. The piercing alert on his phone flashed, SOS signal lost. The words slammed into him like a punch to the ribs. His blood rushed to his face, heat flooding his vision as he leaned forward, every muscle in his body rigid. Yet his eyes remained steady, glinting with a cold, unstoppable focus that only a father, only a soldier, could hold in the face of such terror. Jordan's head tipped slightly, sweat mixing with blood as it traced lines down his cheek and neck. His voice cracked again, weaker now, but somehow even stronger in its resolve. "I have the right to remain silent." RC-55 jerked back slightly as if struck. His laughter came out sharp and broken, a sound too jagged to belong to any human throat. He leaned in again, spitting his fury into Jordan's trembling face. "I am the law," he roared. each syllable vibrating in the stillness like the tolling of a funeral bell. On the highway, Harris's foot crushed the accelerator into the floor. The engines were merging with the siren scream in a single anguished cry. His teeth ground together, a low chant slipping from his lips as if recited from the depths of a prayer or an old battlefield vow. "Hold on, soldier," he breathed, each word fighting its way past the iron grip of fear in his throat. Jordan's fingers curled tighter, his nails digging deeper into the bloody mess that had once been a sandwich bag. His eyes fluttered shut as though drawing strength from a memory too far away for RC-55 to destroy. In that private darkness, he saw his father's face, heard the low rumble of his voice repeating over and over, "Trust the words, trust the law." RC-55's hand twitched, the gun rising, higher now, his entire frame shaking with barely contained violence. His lips parted, the corners twitching as if caught between a snarl and a madman's smile. His mind raced in 1,000 broken directions, none of them reaching the shore of reason. The boy's calm, his stubborn adherence to something greater than fear, ignited a fire in him too hot to be controlled. Jordan's breaths grew shallower, each one sounding like a paper-thin whisper against the heavy silence. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each rise a quiet act of defiance against the weight pushing him down. The smell of gun oil and sweat mixed with the iron scent of blood, a sickening perfume that clung to the narrow space between boy and officer. Harris's car screeched past intersections, the city lights streaking across his windshield like desperate cries for help. His eyes scanned every block, every possible shadow, as though he might somehow pull his son back from the brink with sheer force of will alone. His mouth shaped the words again, softer now, as if speaking to a baby in a crib. "Hold on, hold." Jordan's lips moved one last time, a ghost of a phrase slipping through the blood. Trust. The word barely formed, but its echo felt endless. A soft bell tolling in the corners of his mind. RC-55's face twisted beyond recognition, a grotesque mask of hatred and twisted righteousness. His finger tightened on the trigger, the final moment drawing in like a cold, sharp breath. He threw his head back and howled as though the sky itself might crack open and swallow them whole. And then he leaned in closer, the gun now almost fused with the boy's forehead. His voice split the air raw and jagged. "Law," he roared, spittle flying, eyes shining with a savage light. "Let's see if your law can stop this bullet." In that instant, the world narrowed to a single heartbeat. The fragile thread of hope stretched to its breaking point. And in that breath, where dignity met violence, a question hung. What is the worth of words when faced with the barrel of a gun? The last echo of RC-55's roar still hung in the air when the gun fired, tearing through the thin veil that separated life from loss. Jordan's body jerked, the red hoodie blooming with the dark, spreading stain that crawled across the fabric like a cruel flower opening in the cold morning light. He crumpled forward, knees giving way, his small hands still gripping the ruined bag. Even as he fell, the blood flowed freely now, sliding down the sidewalk, forming quiet rivers that pulled around him in a silent, mournful bloom. RC-55 stood, frozen, his chest heaving, the barrel of his gun still pointed at the boy who no longer moved. His eyes flickered to his hand where a fine mist of blood clung to his skin, shining in the weak sun. His fingers trembled, a tremor running up his arm and into his jaw, but his gaze stayed sharp, icy, as though some twisted instinct refused to let him feel the full weight of what he had done. His breath stuttered, each inhale shallow and ragged, the only sign that he was still tethered to this world by more than just his hatred. Far down the street, Harris's car screamed to a halt, tires shrieking against the asphalt in a desperate protest. He threw open the door before the engine had fully stopped, his boots pounding the ground as he ran, each step a thunderclap in his ears. When he reached the small crumpled shape on the ground, he fell to his knees so hard the sound cracked through the air. He reached out, hands shaking violently, and gathered Jordan's head into his lap, his fingers slipping through the boy's dark, blood-wet curls. "I'm here," Harris cried. Out, his voice raw, each word torn from a heart that had already bled dry onto many battlefields. He bent forward, pressing his forehead to Jordan's, as if trying to pour life back into his son through sheer will. The sidewalk around them glistened red, the sharp metallic smell of blood mixing with the faint sweetness of the crushed sandwich now spilling from the torn bag. Jordan's lips parted, a faint, broken whisper escaping, so soft it barely reached the space between them. Tell Dad sorry. His chest rose once more, shallow and uneven, before sinking like a quiet sigh into the morning air. His fingers twitched, then stilled, the ruined bag slipping from his grasp and tearing open fully as it hit the ground. Egg and sauce spilled onto the blood-soaked concrete. The soft bread soaked in red, a final tragic merging of hope and loss. Harris let out a sound between a sob and a roar. His body shaking under the weight of a grief too large to hold, he scooped up a handful of Jordan's blood, staring at it as it dripped through his fingers, bright and terrible under the pale sun. Slowly, as though pulled by an invisible string, he lifted his gaze to the sky, his eyes searching the endless blue for an answer that would not come. In that wide silence, he saw the faces of fallen brothers, comrades who had died in his arms without time for last words, and now his son, stilled before his eyes. Behind him, RC-55 staggered backward, each step unsure, as though the ground had suddenly turned to shifting sand beneath his boots. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his chest rising in erratic waves. Finally, a single phrase tumbled from his lips, broken and small. What did I do? Arissa's head lowered again, his forehead pressing against Jordan's as if they were sharing one final breath. His hands cradled his son's face, thumbs brushing gently over blood-sick skin. The quiet around them felt heavier than any battlefield. The stillness a kind of violence all its own. Harris's breath rattled in his chest. Each inhale a battle against the tide of loss, trying to pull him under. The torn sandwich bag lay nearby, its contents spread like a small ruined altar. The egg yolk gleamed under the thin light, now mixed irrevocably with blood, a symbol of innocence shattered beyond repair. It seemed to whisper of breakfasts that would never be shared, of stories that would never be told, of hugs that would never be felt again. Harris's fingers curled around his son's blood-soaked hand, lifting it gently, holding it as if it were the most fragile thing left in the world. His voice came out low, each syllable burning through the quiet morning. No one touches my son's blood and lives to see another dawn. In that raw final moment, as the blood on the sidewalk dried and crooked rivers, the world seemed to pause and listen. And in that hush, a question, sharp and eternal, hovered in the air. What would you do to guard the life you love most? Harris's words still echoed in the silent street as he slowly began to rise, each movement heavy, as though he carried not only his sorrow, but the ghosts of every soldier he had ever held as they slipped away. His knees cracked under the strain, his breath thick with the scent of blood and concrete dust. He stood with a kind of ancient slowness, the weight of decades pressing on his shoulders, every inch gained, feeling like a victory snatched from a merciless battlefield. RC-55 watched, his breath coming in short, panic bursts. Sweat poured from his brow, running down his neck in frantic rivers, soaking the collar of his uniform. His fingers hovered near his holster, twitching as though an unseen force kept them from closing around the weapon. His eyes darted to the gun, then back to Harris, and again to the lifeless form on the ground. But no courage came to guide his hand, only the quaking tremor of a man who had finally glimpsed the shape of true consequence. Harris lowered himself once more, dropping beside Jordan with a quiet reverence that felt almost like prayer. He cradled the boy's head, his large hand trembling as it brushed a smear of blood from the young cheek. His thumb paused, tracing a line as though searching for warmth that had already fled. "I'm here, soldier," he whispered. The words softer than a breeze, filled with the weight of every promise he had ever made, every oath spoken beneath moonlit skies and in the shadows of distant forests. His gaze shifted, the tears drying into hard lines at the edges of his eyes. The softness faded, replaced by something colder, older. The quiet ferocity of a man who had lived through the darkness and returned not unscarred but unbowed. He stared down at Jordan, his voice low and hoarse. "You fight better than this," he murmured as though willing his son's spirit back from the edge. His hand squeezed Jordan's limp fingers. The pressure, a final plea to a boy who could no longer answer. In the ragged edges of his mind, Harris saw another night, years ago. Deep in the jungle, a brother in arms had fallen into his lap, blood soaking the earth beneath them. Harris had held him close, voice breaking under the strain of hopelessness. "Don't you leave me," he had pleaded then, the same words now caught in his throat, echoing against the cold concrete and bleeding into the morning air. RC-55 stumbled backward, his knees knocking together, the gun finally slipping from his grasp and clattering against the pavement with a sound that seemed to echo for miles. His shoulders shook violently, breath-catching as if each inhale threatened to shatter him from the inside. His mouth opened, but the words that tried to emerge died before they could form, smothered by the weight of the moment and the shadow of the man rising before him. Harris pressed his forehead to Jordan's one last time, a final touch, a silent benediction shared only between father and son. Then he lifted his head, his spine straightening slowly, deliberately until he stood tall, an unyielding column of flesh and spirit. His eyes found RC-55, locking onto him with a stare so cold it seemed to strip the color from the world around them. RC-55 felt his legs give way, his entire body folding in on itself as though the very marrow in his bones had been siphoned away. He collapsed to his knees, hands shaking in the air, before falling useless at his sides. His eyes flicked wildly, searching for escape, for mercy, for anything that might pull him back from the precipice. Harris now drove him toward. Harry stepped forward, each footfall echoing like a war drum across the narrow street. His face carried the quiet fury of 1,000 unspoken elegies, the deep resolve of a man who had seen death in its truest form, and no longer feared its embrace. His breath came slow and even, each exhale fogging in the crisp morning air like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. The distance closed, each moment stretched thin as a thread. Harris's hands hung at his sides, relaxed but powerful, his fingers curling slightly as though remembering the weight of a rifle or the feel of a brother's last grip. His chest rose and fell, his heart steady in a body that had become a monument to every promise, every ghost, every unbroken vow. When he finally stopped, only a breath away from RC-55, he looked down, his eyes twin shards of winter ice. His voice, when it came, was calm and smooth, but each word landed like a hammer against stone. "Do you know?" he asked softly, pausing so the words could settle into the terrified crevices of the man below him, whom you just declared war on. In that instant, as RC-55 trembled at his feet, the silence seemed to roar louder than any battlefield gunfire, and somewhere in that terrible stillness, a question rose as steady and heavy as an oath. What does it mean to face a man who has already faced death and chosen to stand? Harris's last words hovered in the air, heavy as the morning fog, when his hand reached toward his chest. Slowly, deliberately, he unpinned a small battered insignia, the Delta Force emblem, its edges worn smooth by years of silent service and sacrifice. With careful reverence, he bent down and placed it on Jordan's chest, arranging it as though crowning his son in a final act of love and honor. The metal glinted weakly under the thin sunlight, a silent testament to battles fought far from this broken sidewalk. RC-55's eyes widened, his entire body trembling as though an earthquake had ripped through his bones. His breath turned ragged, lips forming broken shapes without sound. In that cold flash of metal, he saw more than a grieving father. He saw a ghost from stories whispered in frightened corners of the force. "No, Commander Harris." The phantom, the words spilled from his mouth in a strangled soba, each syllable cracked by disbelief and dread. Harris did not flinch, did not soften. His chin dipped once in a tight nod, as if confirming a simple, irrefutable fact. His lips pressed together, holding back an ocean of grief and rage, before he spoke in a voice low and steady as a funeral drum. "You just wrote your final chapter." Each word fell like a stone into still water, rippling outward, impossible to ignore. Our C-55's knees gave out completely. Then he collapsed forward, palms slapping against the pavement, his fingers clawing for something. Forgiveness, escape, anything. "Please, I didn't mean." His voice dissolved into a high, panicked whine, the last defense of a man who had built his strength on the illusion of untouchable power. Harris turned his head slightly, his eyes drifting to the small pool of blood creeping toward the gutter. The smell of iron and asphalt mixed around him, but he barely seemed to breathe it. Instead, his mind drifted back to a long-ago night, a hostage rescue deep in foreign soil. He had knelt over a terrified child, steadying his hands despite the chaos around them. He had promised then, as now, "I never missed a shot. I won't miss justice today." His fingers tightened around Jordan's lifeless hand, the warmth long since stolen, but the connection as fierce as ever. The world seemed to narrow around him, each heartbeat echoing the memory of comrades lost, of children saved, of promises paid in blood. The quiet around them deepened, punctuated only by the weak whimpering of our C-55. Harris's gaze shifted back to the crumpled figure on the ground, but his eyes moved through our C-55 as though he were nothing more than a shadow, an empty uniform without substance. There was no recognition there, no mercy, only the cold certainty of a man who had long since accepted the price of his path. Our C-55 crawled backward, his hands slipping in the blood, leaving frantic streaks on the ground as he tried to scramble away. His voice broke into shards, a pitiful echo of authority now shattered beyond repair. "No, no, this can't be. You can't be him." Harris's jaw clenched, the lines of his face cutting deeper, as though chiseled from stone. His silence weighed heavier than any threat, more final than any shouted command. He moved one step forward, and our C-55 flinched as if struck, his breath choking on a sob. The insignia on Jordan's chest caught a faint glimmer from the morning sky, a silent witness to a legacy of service that stretched beyond borders, beyond life itself. It lay there, small and unassuming, yet louder than any words that could be spoken. In that simple emblem, all the ghosts of Harris's past seemed to gather, standing guard over the fallen boy. Finally, our C-55 managed to force out a question, each word scraping from his throat like broken glass. Who are you?" Arissa's face remained impassive for a moment longer, his eyes hard and endless as winter ice. Then, very slowly, a thin, brittle smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. It was not a smile of joy, nor victory, but a cold acknowledgement of the line that had been crossed and the reckoning that would follow. "You're about to find out," Harris said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken verdicts. In that frozen instant, as our C-55 sobs trembled in the air, a single truth rose above the blood and broken prayers. True justice is not loud. It arrives like a shadow at dawn, unannounced, but impossible to escape. Harris's final words still drifted through the air like a slow-moving fog as he began to move forward, each step firm and steady. The ground beneath him seemed to shudder in quiet recognition of the force now approaching. Our C-55 started to back away, his body moving almost involuntarily, each retreating step marking the transformation of a predator into prey. The hard glint in his eyes cracked and fell away, replaced by the wild, searching gaze of a man realizing too late that the world he thought he controlled was nothing but a fragile illusion. Harris did not need a weapon. His silence carved through the space between them, sharper than any blade, more final than any bullet. Each breath he took seemed to pull our C-55 deeper into the chasm of his fear. The officer's chest rose and fell rapidly, his hands fluttering near his sides like broken wings. The badge pinned to his chest now looked small and meaningless. no longer a shield, but a hollow decoration on a collapsing facade. When Harris finally spoke, his voice was low and unwavering, each word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Without that badge, you're nothing. The sentence landed like a hammer on glass, shattering whatever scraps of confidence our C-55 still clung to. Our C-55's knees buckled, and he dropped to the ground with a sound that seemed to echo in the hollow space around them. His breath came in wet, choking sobs as tears streaked down his dirt-smeared face. His lips moved, the words stuttering and broken. "Please don't." Harris lowered himself, his knees bending so their faces nearly touched. The two men stared at each other, the quiet so thick it pressed on the skin. Harris's eyes were calm but merciless, deep pools of memory and loss. "I saw stronger men beg less," he murmured, each syllable dropping like a cold stone into still water. His breath brushed against our C-5's trembling cheek, a cold ghost of every fallen brother Harris had ever buried. Our C-55's hands fumbled toward the gun lying nearby, fingers scrabbling across the concrete with the desperation of a man drowning in air. But his own body betrayed him, arms shaking too violently to grasp the steel that had once made him feel invincible. The sound of his ragged breathing filled the small space, a pitiful song of defeat and ruin. Harris reached forward, his fingers curling around our C-55's shoulder with a grip neither harsh nor gentle, but firm, inevitable. The officer flinched as though an electric current had surged through him, his head jerking back. Harris leaned in, closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the cold finality of a sealed fate. "This humiliation," he said, pausing so the words could sink deep into the trembling man's bones, "will longer than any bullet." Our C-55's face crumpled completely, his eyes rolling wildly, as if searching for an exit from a nightmare that had already closed its doors. He opened his mouth again, but the words caught in his throat, emerging as a strangled moan that echoed softly off the walls around them. His shoulders convulsed, his body now a puppet with its strings cut, flailing and silent, hopeless spasms. Harris stood slowly, each movement deliberate, the air around him crackling with a quiet, terrible authority. He looked down at the broken men kneeling before him, the gun just beyond reach, a silent reminder that power borrowed through violence is always temporary. The morning sun touched Harris's face, outlining the deep lines etched by time, pain, and choices few would ever understand. Our C-55's eyes darted to the gun again, but the trembling of his fingers betrayed him. With a soft whimper, he finally let his hand fall away, the last symbol of his imagined dominance slipping forever from his grasp. His forehead dropped to the ground, his shoulders shaking with the weight of shame that no badge could shield him from. Now Harris's gaze held steady, seeing not just the man before him, but every face he had ever sworn to protect, every promise carved into his soul. In that silence, he seemed to grow larger, his shadow merging with those of countless ghosts standing with him. Our C-55's breath rattled, his voice now no more than a broken thread. "No, there's another way. I have to call." His words tumbled out, half thought, half prayer. The desperate sound of a man reaching for a rope already burned to ash. In that raw shivering moment, as the morning light touched the broken badge gleaming on the ground, a question lingered like a low, steady drumbeat. What remains of a man when the mask is gone and only the trembling soul stands naked before justice? Our C-55's trembling words still clung to the air when Harris turned away, his gaze sweeping upward as if scanning an unseen horizon. He knelt once more beside Jordan, his large hands settling on the boy's still chest. There was a stillness in Harris, now, the kind that settles only in those who have faced the deepest pits of loss, and returned not with despair, but with a sharpened resolve. With slow, careful movements, Harris reached for the secure radio strapped inside his jacket. The device looked ordinary, but its dark casing held secrets known only to a select few. He pressed the worn button, his thumb steady as stone, and leaned close, his voice low, but echoing with a command that cut through the morning haze like a blade. Commander Harris, Code Black, immediate extraction. The words seemed to hum in the air, resonating with a quiet power that vibrated beneath the skin. Somewhere far beyond the silent rooftops and echoing streets, gears began to turn, shadows shifted, and the old machinery of unseen justice stirred from its slumber. Our C-55's head snapped up, his eyes wide. With raw terror, he staggered backward on his knees, his hands scrabbling against the ground in useless, flailing motions. No, please, mercy. The word mercy left his mouth like a broken plea, a sound stripped of meaning by years of his cruelty. Harris ignored him completely, his attention locked on Jordan as though the rest of the world had dissolved into mist. He brushed his hand gently across the boy's cheek, fingers trembling not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. "I will not bury you," he whispered. He worried, landing softly, but heavy as iron. He leaned in, his forehead touching Jordan's in a final private communion, as though sharing a vow only father and son could understand. The smell of blood hung thick in the air, mixed with the faint tang of gun oil and concrete dust. Harris's other hand pressed against the insignia he had placed on Jordan's chest, a small emblem that now felt like both shield and sword. He lifted his head and looked up at the sky, the pale morning sun glancing off the edges of his weathered face. "I brought them home," he breathed, his voice a memory echoing through time. "I'll bring you back." Our C-55 collapsed fully onto the ground now, his body folding in on itself like a marionette with cut strings. His eyes darted wildly as he patted the pavement, his fingers searching desperately for his discarded phone. His lips formed fragmented prayers, half whispers to a power he no longer controlled. His face twisted, sweat and tears mixing into rivulets that ran down his chin and fell onto the cold ground beneath him. Harris rose again, each movement deliberate and unhurried, as though he were assembling himself piece by piece. The faint whir of distant engines began to drift into the edge of hearing, a low, growing hum that resonated deep in the chest. He pressed the radio once more, repeating with measured certainty, "Code Black confirmed, proceed." As above, the first faint chop of helicopter blades began to cut through the morning silence, each rotation a promise and a warning. The noise grew, swelling into a thunderous roar that rolled across the rooftops and rattled loose pieces of glass. In nearby windows, birds took flight in a sudden, startled rush, their wings slicing through the heavy air as though fleeing from something ancient and unstoppable. Harris turned his gaze back to Jordan, his expression softening for the briefest of moments. He bent again, his large hand closing around Jordan's smaller, lifeless one. The warmth was long gone, but Harris's grip was as firm and tender, as if he still felt a pulse beneath the skin. "Now," he murmured, voice close and raw, "we start the real fight." Our C-55's hand finally closed around his phone, but his fingers slipped, the device clattering from his grasp and skittering out of reach. He let out a thin, reedy cry, a sound so small it was instantly swallowed by the rising roar above. His shoulders sagged, his forehead pressing into the ground in a final posture of defeat. The helicopter's shadow swept across the scene, a dark wave washing over the sidewalk, over Jordan's still form, and across Harris's unwavering figure. In that moving shade, the moment felt suspended between earth and sky, between loss and vengeance, between the quiet grief of a father and the sudden unstoppable momentum of justice in motion. As the wind from the rotors whipped through the narrow street, Harris tightened his hold on Jordan's hand, his head bowing low. And in that storm of noise and dust, one quiet vow seemed to echo beyond the buildings and into the waiting dawn. True justice is not just about vengeance, it is about bringing every lost soul home. The echo of the helicopter blades still trembled in the morning air as Harris pushed the hospital gurney forward, his hands gripping the cold metal frame so tightly his knuckles whitened. His face was stirred with Jordan's blood and his eyes refused to blink, fixed entirely on the boy's pale, slack face. Every step felt like crossing a minefield, each small jolt a cruel reminder that life could vanish at any breath. The hallways swallowed them in sterile light and distant echoes of monitors. Harris bent over, whispering close to Jordan's ear, his words ragged but sharp as a blade. "Hold on. I'm here. Fight with me." The smell of antiseptic fought against the heavy scent of blood still clinging to his clothes. A bitter mix that scraped at his memories. RC-55 sat slumped in a temporary holding cell nearby, his head bowed low, though his shoulders drooped in defeat. His eyes darted in restless circles. Evolve still searching for an exit, his fingers drummed the metal table slowly. Each tap a pulse of dark intent, each breath a promise unspoken. "Still, not over, I have one more move," he muttered. The words so faint they dissolved into the air before fully formed. Inside the emergency room, Harris stood at Jordan's side, his shadow stretching long across the floor. The boy's chest rose and fell unevenly, each inhale a fragile defiance against the darkness threatening to pull him under. Harris's large hand wrapped around the IV line, squeezing as though he could push the medicine faster, force life back into the young body before him. He stared at the clear fluid dripping down and slow, merciless rhythm, each drop echoing in his mind like the beat of a distant war drum. The liquid seemed to morph before his eyes, shifting into red, heavy droplets, each one a memory of blood lost on old fields, each one a brother he couldn't save. His jaw clenched, a tremor running through the rigid set of his shoulder. Jordan's hand twitched weakly, fingers curling as though trying to grasp the edge of the world. His lips parted, a soundless gasp fighting its way up before finally breaking free in a ragged whisper. "Dad, fight with me." The words shivered through the air, as delicate and powerful as a final note on a battlefield bugle, a flash of memory overtook Harris. Then Afghanistan, the heavy night air thick with dust and cries, a young soldier in his arms, the same pleading eyes, the same fragile pulse beneath his fingers. He had whispered into the darkness, "I can't save them all, but I must save this one." Now that vow rose again, roaring inside him, burning hotter than any battlefield flame. Jordan strained, his fingers dragging across the starched white sheet, nails biting down so hard they left thin red crescent in the fabric. Each movement left small smudges of blood, a silent testimony to the invisible war raging inside his fragile frame. Harris leaned in, his breath trembling against the boy's ear. "I'm here. I will not let go. You hear me?" Outside the emergency bay, Rossi 55's breath grew more ragged, his eyes wide and gleaming in the harsh fluorescent light. His fingers continued their restless drumming, tapping out a rhythm of schemes still blooming inside his fevered mind. "Still not over. Still not over." His muttering seeped into the walls, a venomous echo that refused to die. Harris's eyes flicked to the window, staring out at the fading morning sky beyond the glass. The world outside felt distant, like a quiet painting, beyond reach, yet its light touched his face, reminding him of every promise he had ever made, every child he had vowed to protect. He pressed his forehead gently to Jordan's, closing his eyes as if sharing the breath between them. "Stay," he whispered, the word so soft it almost didn't exist. "Stay with me, soldier." Jordan's breaths grew shallower, his face pale and drawn tight around the edges. His fingers twitched once more, then stilled, the thin red lines on the sheet shining like wounds on a battlefield map. A sudden alarm shriek through the quiet, slicing into Harris's mind like a blade. The flat, piercing sound of monitors filled the room, and the doctor's voice cut through the air. Code blue. Harris lunged forward, his hands gripping Jordan's shoulders, eyes wide with a terror no battlefield had ever carved into him. "Don't you leave me now," he shouted, the words tearing from his throat raw and shaking. The lights above seemed to shiver, the room collapsing inward around them as the thin line between life and death wavered like a fragile flame in a storm. And in that suspended breath, a question flickered like a distant star. How far will a father go to hold the heartbeat of his child? The piercing shriek of the hospital alarm still echoed in the back of Harris's mind as he stepped into the stark interrogation room. The air here felt colder, denser, as though it carried the weight of every unspoken confession and silent betrayal that had ever passed through its walls. RC-55 sat hunched at the metal table, hands cuffed tightly, sweat pooling along his hairline and dripping into his collar. His eyes were wild and red-rimmed, darting from corner to corner like a trapped animal searching for a crack of light. On the screen behind him, a silent video began to play, flickering with harsh clarity. The room filled with grainy images, RC-55 in a dark hallway. A young man screaming, a baton raised again and again. The sickening sound of flesh meeting metal seemed to echo even in the silence. RC-55 jerked violently in his chair, his voice cracking into a desperate hoarse plea. Stop it, stop it. Harris stood on the other side of the table, arms folded across his chest, his eyes cold and unmoving, his voice sliced through the air, low and cutting. That's who you are. The words dropped like stones into a deep well, their ripples impossible to ignore. RC-55 turned away, his shoulders trembling, the shackles on his wrists clinking in nervous rhythm. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps, each one hitching as though he might choke on his shame. His lips moved without sound, silent prayers to a power he no longer commanded. Harris pressed a button on a small device, and a recording began to play, filling the room with a rasping, hushed voice, RC-55's voice. For order, we must control them at any cost. The words crawled across the walls, thick and heavy. A confession too monstrous to remain hidden. RC-55 slammed his fists against the table, his head thrown back, a guttural cry tearing from his throat. Stop, please stop. His forehead struck the cold metal and he slid down slowly, his body folding in on itself. Tears streamed down his cheeks, mixing with snot and sweat as he shook in helpless convulsions. Harris moved closer, leaning over until his face hovered just above the broken man. His voice softened, almost gentle, but no warmth filled the words. Truth is in a grenade, he murmured, his breath ghosting across RC-55's ear. It's a surgical blade. The cameras mounted in the corners of the room rolled steadily, broadcasting every word, every tremor, every flicker of horror to a nation waiting in tense silence. In homes across the country, families gathered around screens, their hands clasped over their mouths, eyes wide with a cocktail of grief and revelation. Old veterans watched with clenched fists, mothers with trembling lips, fathers with tear-streaked cheeks. RC-55 gagged, a dry heave that racked his body from the inside out. His head dropped fully to the table now, tears dripping down to form small, dark pools on the stainless steel surface. His voice cracked in a final pitiful whisper, please, mercy. But the walls around him offered no echo back, only the cold humming whine of the recording as it played on. Iris stood tall again, his silhouette sharp against the bright interrogation lights. He turned slightly to face the main camera, his eyes locking onto the invisible millions watching beyond the lens. His face held no triumph, only an unyielding clarity. This is not just about my son, he said, his words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of generations. This is about every life crushed under a badge misused, every silent scream buried beneath concrete and fear. The room seemed to tighten around him, the air heavy as though pressing down on every chest. Rossi, 55, sobbed into the table, his fingers clawing uselessly at the slick surface, leaving thin red scratches where his nails caught the skin of his palms. Harris stepped back, the cold certainty in his movements, echoing the discipline of a lifetime on battlefields far from home. He glanced once more at the broken figure before him, then at the badge discarded on the floor. The light glinted off its metal surface, a tarnished symbol of what had been lost long before this day began. RC-55 lifted his head slowly, his face a ruin of salt and shame, his lips peeled back in a grimace that might have once been a sneer. I still have a friend in high places, he hissed, voice thin and shaking. I'm not done yet. In that pause, where the world seemed to hold its breath, One question bled into the silent corners of every watching heart. What remains of power when stripped of all illusion, and what is left of a man when the veil is finally torn away? The hiss of RC-55's final threat still clung to the edges of the air when Harris stepped forward into the harsh glow of the studio lights. His son's dried blood still stained his face and soaked into the dark fibers of his uniform shirt. The smell of iron clung to him like an invisible shroud, a scent that no soap or flame could ever fully erase. His boots echoed softly across the polished floor, a quiet, steady march that carried every ghost and every promise he had ever made. The cameras turned toward him, their red lights glowing like silent eyes in the shadows. Across the country, television screens flickered to life. In small living rooms and vast city apartments, in veterans' halls and nursing homes, millions of Americans leaned forward, their hands tightened on armrests or each other's fingers. The soft hum of breath filling spaces that felt suddenly too small for the grief that waited within them. Harris stood behind the podium without adjusting his collar, without brushing the dried blood from his cheek. He looked directly into the camera, his gaze piercing and unwavering, as though he were standing not before a machine, but before each person, eye to eye, heart to heart. He drew in a slow breath, his chest rising heavily as though weighed down by every loss, every folded flag he had ever handed to a mother or father in some quiet tears-soaked corner of the world. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, yet it carried a strength that seemed to reverberate in the bones of every listener. "I am not a hero," he began, each word shaped carefully, carved from the depths of a wound no uniform could cover. "I am just a father." In that instant, across living rooms and waiting rooms, in bars and shelters, silence spread like a solemn tide. Old veterans reached for each other's hands, gripping them tightly, their eyes shining under fluorescent lights. Mothers pressed trembling lips against photographs. Young soldiers home from wars they barely understood felt a lump rise in their throats. Harris paused, his eyes scanning across the lens as though he were looking beyond the glass and wire, beyond the miles of fields and highways, straight into the small spaces inside each heart. "You call us soldiers abroad," he continued, his voice turning softer but no less fierce. "But what about the war inside our neighborhoods? Who stands guard when the enemy is dressed like a friend, when the threat walks among us with a badge meant to protect?" He lowered his gaze for a moment, his fingers moving to the insignia over his heart. The Delta Force emblem felt heavy beneath his palm, a silent reminder of every mission, every line crossed and never crossed, every life he had once carried back to trembling arms. His thumb pressed into it gently, as though he were offering it back to the earth. When he looked up again, his eyes glistened, but did not break. "Justice," he said, pausing as though tasting the word, weighing its true shape in his mouth, "is not a gift, it is a debt we owe our children." His words rolled out across the nation, washing over every room and street corner, every quiet backyard where old men sat smoking in the evening. They slid into the cracks of memory, where old wounds slept but never fully healed, and where hope trembled like a candle against the wind. At that same moment, in the sterile hush of an intensive care room, Jordan's breath shuddered under the watchful hands of a nurse. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening for the faint, uneven rhythm that faltered and surged like a distant tide. Her fingers lay gently on his ribs, feeling the small tremors of life still fighting. Beneath bruised skin, Jordan's face was pale, framed by tubes and quiet machinery, each beep a fragile stitch holding him in place. His eyelids fluttered weakly like moth wings in the dark, searching for a flame they could no longer find. In the isolation of his holding cell, RC-55 began to unravel completely. His forehead struck the concrete wall with a dull thud. Again and again, a rhythmic chant of despair echoing off the cold stone, his voice clawed up from his throat in hoarse, broken fragments. "No, no, this can't end this way." His hands tore at his hair, eyes wide and unfocused, seeing not the wall before him, but the shadow of a father's gaze that had stripped him bare before the entire world. Back in the studio, Harris's breath came slower now, each inhale pulling against the tight cords in his neck. He looked again into the camera, his voice lowering to a near whisper that still managed to carry across the nation. "I did not come here to point fingers," he said. "I came to show you my son's face. I came to show you the cost of silence, the price of turning away." He stepped away from the podium, his hands slipping once more over the Delta insignia, fingers pressing down as though feeling for a pulse beneath his skin, his head bowed, not in surrender, but in a quiet salute to every fallen soul, to every echo of a promise kept too late. In hospitals and living rooms, on quiet front porches and crowded subway cars, tears slid down countless cheeks. Some rose to their feet without realizing it, standing as though summoned by a silent roll call. In one small town, an elderly veteran lifted his withered cap and pressed it against his chest, his shoulders shaking as a single tear traced the lines of his worn face. In Jordan's room, the nurse leaned in, her ear straining for each uneven beat, her palm pressed a little harder, willing the heart beneath to keep its fragile rhythm. Her lips moved silently, offering prayers only she could hear, or 355 curled into himself in the concrete cell, his breath ragged, fingers smeared with blood from his forehead, his words twisted into a final, desperate mantra. "No, no, no." The sound spilled out, a broken lullaby meant only for himself. Harris's final words in the studio rose above every flickering screen and trembling heart. "We do not inherit justice," he said, each word weighted like a stone laid on a grave. "We build it every day, every moment, and when we fail, it is our children who pay." He stepped back from the podium, his eyes never leaving the camera until the final moment, as though etching his gaze into the memory of each witness. Then he turned, the dried blood on his shirt catching the harsh lights. A quiet red flag carried into the darkness. Outside the glass walls of the studio, crowds had begun to gather in silent knots. Candles flickered against the night breeze, their flames bending and dancing as though listening to the words that had just been spoken. A child held up a small sign drawn in crooked letters. "Justice for Jordan," in the last echo of Harris's voice. As the room emptied into a hushed, reverent quiet, a doctor stepped from behind a curtain in the hospital hallway. His eyes found Harris, who stood waiting, body tense as a drawn bowstring. The doctor's shoulders sagged, and he gave the slightest shake of his head. "Prepare yourself," he said, his voice low, as though afraid to disturb the thin veil still clinging to the boy in the next room. And in that small final hush, a question seemed to drift through the night air, resting gently on every weary heart. "What does it mean to carry justice on your shoulders? And who will bear it when we are gone?" The soft echo of the doctor's final words still hung in Harris's ears when he stepped away from the bright studio lights, his mind sharpening into the cold clarity of an old battlefield. The grief that had once pressed on his chest now settled into a quiet, coiled resolve. Each movement felt deliberate, as though he were stepping once more into a dark jungle, where every leaf could hide a trap, and every heartbeat marked the line between life and death. Meanwhile, RC-55 sat hunched in the stark shadows of his cell, his body rocking back and forth like a broken metronome. The cement walls pressed in on him, damp and cold, echoing the fragmented whispers of his unraveling mind. His fingers trembled violently as he fumbled for a small hidden phone slipped into his waistband, a last secret lifeline, his final move in a game he thought he still controlled. He punched in a sequence with shaking hands, his breath catching in his throat. The words tumbled out, ragged and desperate, each syllable torn from a throat raw with screams. "Activate the plan." His voice splintered against the concrete walls, the command slithering out into the quiet corridors beyond. At the same moment, Harris moved through a dim hallway, his boots clicking softly against the floor. He raised a secure line to his lips, the device small but heavy with consequence. His voice dropped low, every syllable carrying the sharp edge of a veteran who had learned long ago to speak so that no word was wasted. Code Black Phase 2. Neutralize threats from within. In that simple chilling order, a silent current sparked through the veins of a sleeping network. Hidden rooms flickered to life with red lights. Men and women in plain clothes reached beneath their jackets, fingers brushing the cold steel of weapons carried not for pride but for purpose. Eyes narrowed behind dark glasses and radios crackled with Tor confirmations. Somewhere in a distant alley, a figure flipped a knife in the dark, nodding once before disappearing into the city's labyrinthine veins. Harris paused by a window, the city's glow painting faint reflections across his weathered face. Slowly, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing an old tattoo hidden beneath layers of scars and time. The insignia of his covert team. Its ink had faded, but its meaning had only deepened. A living O stitched into his very skin, his fingers traced at once lightly as if greeting an old friend on the eve of battle. In the cell, Marcy 55 froze, his eyes bulging as he watched the single red indicator on his phone blink rapidly. His voice cracked into a high, trembling pitch. "How did you know?" The words spilled out as a confession and an accusation, collapsing under the weight of his unraveling power. Ayers did not even glance toward the cell. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon beyond the window, where the night pressed close around the city's edges like a predator waiting to strike. His voice was low, barely more than a breath. Yet each word carried the force of a hammer falling in a silent hall. "I always watch my six." Across the city, a convoy of black SUVs rolled out from a hidden garage, their headlights cutting through the night in disciplined formation. On rooftops, figures shifted into position, scanning alleys and side streets, each pair of eyes sharpened by years of unseen wars. In the darkness below, silent boots pressed into wet asphalt, moving like shadows, swallowed and reborn with each step. RC-55 clawed at his hair, his fingers slipping against the sweat soaking his forehead. His eyes darted wildly around the room, but no door offered escape. No window offered forgiveness. His voice rose into a strangled scream, echoing down the empty hallways like the final cry of a trapped animal. "They're coming for you next." But Harris did not turn. His hand settled over his insignia once more, thumb pressing down in a silent affirmation. The memory of Jordan's face flared in his mind, a still image burning brighter than any spotlight or camera flash. He felt the boy's small, strong hand in his own, the warmth of hope and the sharp ache of loss intertwined so tightly that they could no longer be separated. Outside, the city seemed to hold its breath. In some corners, street lights flickered as though winking out in deference to the darkness creeping in. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a lone voice splitting the hush like a crack in old armor. Back in the command center, screens lit up with live feeds from hidden cameras. Operators in black uniforms spoke in clipped phrases, their hands moving over keyboards and touch screens with surgical precision. Faces were identified, routes marked, and contingencies prepared. In every hidden corner, the promise of retribution waited, coiled and silent, ready to strike with a surgeon's cold focus. Eris's breath slowed, deep and even, each inhale a quiet preparation, each exhale a vow. His eyes narrowed, focused not on the chaos that might come, but on the quiet, steady path through it. In the reflection of the window before him, he did not see a grieving father or a decorated soldier. He saw the living echo of every oath he had ever made, and as the network of his allies moved closer, as boots met concrete and silent figures slipped past checkpoints unseen, Harris whispered into the darkness, his words a quiet pulse against the hum of an ancient city's heartbeat. "Justice isn't loud," he murmured, the words vanishing into the night air. "It's the silence that follows when evil finally falls." In that hush, a question rose like a distant echo. In every quiet living room, every guarded watchtower, every lonely heart bracing against the darkness, when the last line is crossed, who stands to draw it again? The quiet hum of the city still resonated beneath Harris's skin as he stepped through the narrow hallway, the echo of his boots measured and patient. Every breath felt heavy, each step carrying the ghosts of every oath he had sworn, every promise he had carried across oceans and battlefields. Beyond the final door waited a man who had traded his soul for power, a man whose name had once meant protection, but had long since become a hollow threat, whispered behind closed doors. The room he entered was dimly lit, the only illumination, a single yellow bulb swinging gently from the ceiling, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. A conference table stretched across the room, its polished surface now dull under the sickly light. Papers were scattered like fallen leaves, maps marked with coded lines and quiet betrayals. At the far end sat the police chief, the true architect behind the chaos, his fingers steepled under his chin, eyes narrowed and unblinking. For a moment, the two men simply regarded each other, the air between them thick and electric. Harris's face remained unreadable, his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. The police chief shifted slightly in his chair, as if trying to straighten a spy that no longer had the strength to hold him upright. Finally, the chief's lips parted. His voice, a low growl, cracked at the edges. "We keep order our way." The words were tossed across the room like a challenge, sharp and brittle, echoing off the walls with a tremor that betrayed more fear than authority. Harris let the words settle into the silence, his chest rising and falling slowly, as though measuring each breath with the patience of an old soldier counting heartbeats in the dark. His eyes never wavered as he stepped closer, his boots sinking into the worn carpet like anchors dropping into deep water. "Order built on blood is an order," Harris replied, his voice soft, but as unyielding as steel. "It's tyranny." Each syllable fell into the room like a hammer, driving cracks into the thin veneer of power the chief still clung to. In one fluid motion, Harris pulled a thick file from beneath his arm and tossed it onto the table. The papers fanned out across the surface, photographs sliding free, images of secret meetings, hidden transactions, faces pale under security camera lights. Each picture was a nail in a coffin that the chief had long pretended did not exist. "I came alone because I don't need backup to finish you," Harris said, his voice low, almost conversational, as though they were two old friends discussing the weather rather than the fate of a city. The chief's hand trembled, reaching beneath the table. His fingers closed around the grip of a pistol hidden just out of view, the metal cold and slick with sweat. His eyes darted up to Harris, pupils wide, breath stuttering as he pulled the gun into the dim light. The muzzle wavered, a silent stutter betraying the shaking of his wrist. Harris didn't flinch. His hands remained at his sides, fingers loose, shoulders relaxed. His eyes stayed locked on the chief's face. Not on the weapon, not on the trembling hand, but on the small, quivering line at the corner of the man's mouth. The final tell of a man who had already lost. "Pull it," Harris said, the words soft, almost gentle. "And I'll make sure your name is erased before sunrise." The threat carried no rage, no thunder. It was simply a statement of fact and inevitability, spoken by a man who had walked with death and come back unbroken. The chief's breath came in ragged gasps, now his knuckles white around the gun. His shoulders slumped as though the weight of every choice, every betrayal, every secret payment finally settled into his bones. The gun slipped from his fingers, clattering against the table before spinning to a quiet stop. Slowly, he collapsed into the chair behind him, his body folding in on itself. His head dropped forward, hands falling limply to his sides. The yellow light above them continued its slow, swaying dance, painting shifting shapes on the walls, as if echoing the final, silent collapse of a broken regime. Harris stepped forward once more, his boots whispering against the floor. He stopped just before the table, his eyes lowering to the photographs scattered like accusations across the polished wood. His fingers brushed over one, pausing for a moment as if feeling the pulse of every life it represented. In that silent space, the two men existed as shadows. One, the architect of a fragile empire built on fear. The other, the quiet force that had come to tear it down. There were no more words left to trade, no more masks to wear. Only the raw, trembling shape of truth remained between them, humming in the quiet like a blade pressed against skin. The chief lifted his head slowly, eyes glistening under the flickering light. His voice cracked, almost a whisper, the final gasp of a man staring into the abyss he had dug with his own hands. "You think it ends here?" His lips twisted around the words, disbelief and despair twining together in a final pitiful plea. "You just started a war." And in that shivering breath between threat and surrender, a question hovered like the last breath of a dying star. When all power is stripped away, what remains of a man beyond the weight of his own choices? The echo of the police chief's final words still reverberated in Harris's mind as the heavy doors of the federal courtroom swung open. The sharp scent of polished wood and stale paper filled the air, a quiet testament to decades of whispered judgments and quiet reckonings. The room was bathed in harsh white light, each beam cutting across the polished floor like a blade. Rows of people filled the benches, their faces lined with worrying and unspoken prayer. Our C-55 shuffled into the courtroom, under heavy guard, his wrists bound, each step betraying the trembling of a man stripped bare before the world. His eyes darted from side to side, but he avoided the front row where Harris sat motionless, his silhouette rigid and cold. The dried blood on Harris's shirt had darkened to a deep solemn brown, a quiet emblem of sacrifice no badge could outshine. A massive screen flickered to life behind the judge's bench. The first frame appeared, and the room fell into a suffocating hush. It was the image of Jordan lying on the sidewalk, his hoodie soaked in crimson, his chest eerily still. A collective shiver moved through the audience, a ripple of grief and horror that seemed to travel from heart to heart without a single word spoken. Our C-55's head dropped, shoulders sagging under a weight heavier than any chain. Tears slipped from his eyes, carving pale paths down his flushed cheeks. His lips parted, trembling around the words that escaped as broken gasps. "Please forgive me." His voice was barely a whisper, a sound that withered before it reached the farthest walls. Harris didn't blink, his eyes bored into our C-55 like a silent spear, unmoving and merciless. Slowly, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers interlaced in a quiet, deadly patience. When he spoke, his words felt like cold iron laid gently across the back of the neck. "Look at me when you die inside." Our C-55's gaze flicked up, caught in Harris's unwavering stare, then fell again instantly, as though scorched by the raw truth he saw reflected at him. His breath came in uneven shudders, a desperate plea for escape that would never come. At the defense table, our C-55's attorney shifted in his seat, his eyes dark and distant. Slowly, with the resigned air of a man accepting a fate long postponed, he rose. His hand trembled as he gathered the papers before him. Without a single backward glance, he let them fall to the floor, the sound of paper scattering across the wood, echoing like a final verdict. He turned on his heel and walked out, his steps heavy, his head bowed beneath a weight no brief could defend. Our C-55's head snapped up at the sudden abandonment, his mouth falling open in a silent cry, his fingers clawed at the table's edge, nails scraping the smooth surface as though he could pull himself back from the abyss, now yawning at his feet. Ira straightened in his seat, his face carved in stillness, the lines on his forehead, deep and unyielding. His voice rose again, low and resonant, each word landing with a precision that left no room for argument. "Your silence is your confession." On the screen, the footage continued to play. Jordan's fingers twitching, his chest shuddering in that final trembling effort to hold on to life. The camera caught every detail, the blood pooling in small rivers, the broken sandwich beside him. A quiet emblem of innocence lost forever. The crowd watched, their hands gripping each other, their breaths caught in throats too tight to release. A spotlight swung across the courtroom, its beam catching our C-55's face in full. For a moment, the light carved through every layer of pretense and bravado. illuminating the raw, quivering core beneath. The harsh glare revealed the cracks running through his once impenetrable mask, the fractures that now gaped open under the weight of truth. A woman in the back row covered her mouth, tears sliding through her fingers. An elderly man in a faded, military jacket pressed his cap to his chest, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Somewhere near the aisle, a young father clutched his daughter's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. RC-55's chest convulsed with shallow sobs, his body folding inward, as though trying to vanish into the small space he occupied. Each cry slipped from his lips like a dying wind, a sound that filled the room with a cold, echoing emptiness. Harris closed his eyes for a moment, the image of Jordan's face rising behind his eyelids. He felt the warmth of a small hand in his, the fleeting memory of a laugh that once filled their kitchen like music. When he opened his eyes again, they shone, not with tears, but with the icy clarity of a man who had buried too many dreams to waste another word. RC-55's shoulders slumped further, his forehead dropping to the table's surface. The skin at his temples glistened with sweat, each drop sliding down as though marking each lost defense, each lie that had finally crumbled. In that moment of absolute stillness, as the courtroom held its collective breath, a small monitor in a nearby hospital room flickered in quiet warning. Jordan's body, pale beneath the stark sheets, jerked violently. The nurse's eyes went wide, her voice rising into a sharp, terrified plea, "We're losing him." The courtroom fell into a deeper silence, as though each heartbeat had paused to listen for an echo that might never return. And in that hush, a question hovered above every bowed head and trembling hand. When the lights go out and all masks are stripped away, what remains to tell us who we truly are? The echo of the nurse's desperate cry, "We're losing him," still reverberated in Harris's chest as he stepped out onto the hospital balcony. The night air felt thick against his skin, carrying the faint scent of candle wax and the low hum of 1,000 quiet prayers. His eyes, raw and rimmed red, scanned the sea of people gathered below, each face a flickering point of light against the dark city backdrop. Down in the streets, the crowd stretched beyond the horizon, a living river of grief and resolve. People stood shoulder to shoulder, each holding a candle or a photo of Jordan, his young face printed in sharp aching clarity. The small flames shivered in the night breeze, yet none went out, as if each flame carried its promise to stay alive, no matter the weight of the night pressing in around them. They did not chant slogans of hate or vengeance. Instead, a soft trembling song rose from their lips, weaving through the night like a gentle tide. Amazing grace drifted upward, each verse catching in throats, but pushing forward. Each note a quiet rebellion against the darkness that had tried to swallow them whole. On the balcony above, Harris's fingers curled tightly around the cold metal railing. His knuckles turned white under the strain. His teeth set hard against the tremor rising in his chest. His mind drifted back to a far quieter night years ago, when a tiny, impossibly fragile hand had wrapped around his finger for the first time. That small grip had once felt stronger than any weapon he had ever carried, stronger than any command barked across a battlefield. A lone veteran in the crowd stood a few steps forward, his back straight despite the heavy tremor in his shoulders. He removed his faded cap, his wrinkled fingers shaking as they pressed it to his chest. Tears blurred his vision as he looked up, the moonlight catching the wet shine on his cheeks. His voice, rough with age and regret, carried softly into the quiet around him. "He is every son we failed to protect." The words cut through Harris like a blade, deeper and colder than any bullet he had ever faced. His grip on the railing tightened, metal groaning faintly under the pressure. A low growl rumbled from deep inside his chest, words pressing against his teeth. "Not again," he hissed, his breath ragged. "Never again." In a darkened cell far across town, RC-55 sat hunched before a television screen, the harsh light from the broadcast painting harsh lines across his face. His hands clawed at the thin blanket around his shoulders, his fingers moving in frantic, broken patterns. On the screen, he saw the candles, the photos, the endless wave of humanity joined in a single unwavering voice. His mouth opened, the words spilling out in a cracked, disbelieving whisper. I started this. I started all this. The realization trembled through him, each repetition digging deeper, tearing away the last of the thin, tattered defenses that had once defined him. His head dropped, his body folding over his knees as a tremor racked through him, each sob strangled and small in the vast emptiness of the cell. Back on the hospital balcony, Harris leaned forward slightly, his face bathed in the gentle glow of candle light reflecting from below. His eyes, though hard as iron in the courtroom, now shimmered with a fragile sheen, a final flicker of the man who had once carried his son on broad shoulders through sunlit afternoons. Inside the hospital room behind him, Jordan lay still under sterile white sheets. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uncertain waves, each breath a quiet rebellion against the final darkness threatening to pull him under. His hand, once so strong, in its smallness, now lay limp at his side, fingers curled slightly as though reaching for something just out of reach. A nurse hovered beside him, her eyes locked on the monitor above the bed. The lines on the screen were jagged and uneven, each spike a plea, each drop a warning. She pressed her palm gently to his chest, feeling the faint vibration of a heart, fighting beyond its strength. In a final trembling memory, Harris saw the day Jordan was born. The small wrinkled face, the first cry that shattered the sterile silence of the delivery room. He remembered the way Jordan's fingers curled instinctively around his, a simple wordless promise that neither of them could have understood fully, but both had felt in their bones. Outside, the crowd's song rose again, each verse swelling in strength and sorrow. The candles burned brighter now, as if the flames themselves refused to surrender to the coming dawn. Faces lifted toward Harris, eyes red but steadfast, hands holding photos and candles aloft as though offering their shared grief into the night sky. Jordan's eyelids fluttered weakly, a final fragile attempt to cling to the world slipping from his grasp. His fingers twitched once, a fleeting echo of the baby's grasp that had once meant the world. The nurse leaned in closer, her voice trembling. "Stay with us," she whispered, though the words sounded more like a prayer than a command. In the cell, RC-55's cries turned into quiet, hiccuping gasps. His hands covered his face, shoulders shaking violently as though trying to expel the poison of his actions. The screen before him showed Harris standing above the people, the candles gleaming like tiny stars, each one a silent testament to a life now hanging by a thread. The monitor beside Jordan's bed emitted a sharp, steady tone that sliced through the quiet room like a funeral bell. The nurse's eyes widened, her hand darting for the emergency button as she screamed into the hallway. "Code blue, we're losing him." On the balcony, Harris's head snapped toward the sound, his fingers slipping from the railing. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt beneath him, the swell of the song below surging up to catch his falling breath. His eyes widened, the remembered warmth of that small hand now an icy phantom curling around his heart, and in that instant, as the last thread of hope strained against the pool of the dark, a question rose from every candle flame, every broken cry, every trembling breath held in the crowd. When the final light flickers, who will hold it steady so it does not vanish into the night? The sharp tone of the heart monitor still echoed in Harris's ears as he turned away from the hospital balcony and stepped into the echoing halls of justice once more. The cold, hard floor under his boots felt heavier than any battlefield ground he had crossed. Every step carried the quiet gravity of a man who had seen too much, carried too many final words, and now stood before the final reckoning of all those hidden in shadow. In the stark, windowless chamber, Roxy 55 knelt behind a cage of reinforced bars, his head hung low, shoulders quaking with each strangled breath. His uniform was gone, replaced by a simple jumpsuit, its fabric clinging to him like a shroud. Overhead lights cast harsh beams that seemed to peel away the last layers of pretense, leaving only the raw, trembling core of a man who could no longer run from the mirror. The door creaked open, and Harris stepped in, his silhouette tall and unwavering, His eyes were hollow now, no fire, no vengeance, only a silent, cavernous emptiness that swallowed every word before it could take shape. He stopped a few feet from the cage, his hands at his sides, fingers slightly curled as though holding an invisible weight. RC-55 lifted his head slowly, his eyes wild and red, mouth open in a silent plea that died before it reached the air. His lips trembled as he tried to form words, but they came out as a broken cry. Then, as if something snapped deep inside, his voice tore free in a ragged, explosive wail. I did it for order. You told me to. You promised we'd be safe if we controlled them. The words filled the room, bouncing off the concrete walls. Each syllable a shard of shattered illusions. Harris did not move, did not blink. His eyes held RC-55 in place as surely as any chain could. After a long, suffocating silence, Harris's voice finally came, low and even, each word falling like a stone into a silent pond. No, you chose. Outside the cage, agents moved with swift precision. Files were collected, doors swung open and shut, and figures in tailored suits once untouchable in marble offices were led out in single lines. Faces pale, eyes darting nervously, they stumbled under the weight of truth finally pulled into the light. One senior official, his face ghostly white, tried to speak, his voice cracking under the strain. He didn't know he'd go that far. Harris turned his head slightly, his eyes flicking toward the official. For a moment, he seemed to study the man, measuring every line of fear etched into his face. Then he closed his eyes slowly, a long, weary exhale slipping from his lips. You all knew. The words carried no rage, no accusation, only the quiet, merciless gravity of fact. The official's knees buckled and he collapsed into the arms of the waiting agents, his protest dissolving into dry, useless gasps. Behind him, the others shuffled forward, their shoes scuffing against the floor in a grim, resigned procession. Each step felt like a final confession, each stagger a silent acknowledgement of the lives they had traded for power. Inside the cage, RC-55's body convulsed as he tried to rise, his hands scrabbling at the bars. His mouth opened and closed, guttural noises spilling out like the panicked cries of an animal cornered at last. His knees struck the floor again, and again, a rhythm of despair echoing through the sterile chamber. He pressed his forehead to the cold steel, breath coming in short, sharp bursts. His fingers clawed at the air beyond the bars, grasping for forgiveness that would never come. Harris watched without flinching. His mind drifted just for a moment to a memory of Jordan's first steps, that unsteady yet triumphant march toward a father's open arms. That innocence now lay far behind, buried beneath layers of betrayal and blood. His eyes fluttered shut briefly, as though to hold that distant warmth for one final breath. When he opened them again, they were empty mirrors reflecting nothing but the quiet echo of duty fulfilled. He turned away from RC-55, the figure behind the bars now reduced to a shivering, voiceless shell. As Harris stepped toward the exit, the sun broke through the clouds outside, a soft golden ray filtering through the narrow window above. It fell across his shoulders, catching on the dried blood still marking his shirt. An old wound turned into a silent badge. He paused at the doorway, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame. In a voice so soft it barely stirred the air, he spoke as though to himself, to the ghosts following his every step, to a sun waiting somewhere beyond reach. I kept my promise, and in that final whisper, a question drifted out into the dawning light, settling into every heart that had watched and wept. When the dust clears and the last word is spoken, what weight do we carry in the silence left behind? The echo of Harris's quiet words, I kept my promise, still lingered in the pale morning light as he stepped back into the small hospital room. The walls seemed to close around him gently, the muted beeps and distant footsteps fading into a soft, reverent hush. The air felt heavy with finality. Yet there was a fragile tenderness woven through every breath, and a simple wooden table sat, a polished metal, its surface catching the weak sunlight and scattering it in small fleeting sparks across the floor. A paper beside it bore the seal of the city, an offer inked with hope and desperation. A leadership role in rebuilding and reforming the police force. For a long moment, Harris stood still, his eyes tracing the edges of the metal, the smooth curves that once might have meant honor. His hand reached out, fingers hovering above it. He let them rest there for a heartbeat, then pushed the metal gently away. His voice, quiet and certain, filled the small room. Not for me, the words floated into the air, resting there like a prayer, then dissolving into the stillness. Outside the room, a doctor stepped forward, his face drawn and weary. He paused at the threshold, eyes meeting Harris's, with a weight that needed no words. He took in a long, slow breath before speaking, each syllable heavy with reluctant surrender. He's gone, but he fought. The words landed with the force of a silent cannon, shaking something deep inside Harris that no battle had ever reached. He lowered his gaze to Jordan, his son, lying so still beneath the thin blanket. The room felt impossibly small now, each wall pushing closer as if trying to hold the final moment within its grasp. Harris stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly as it reached for Jordan's, his fingers wrapped gently around the young hand, once so full of warmth and small, determined squeezes. Now it felt cold, slack, yet in its weight he felt the echo of every laugh, every breath, every step shared along the way. Rest now, soldier, Harris whispered, the words catching at the edge of his throat before tumbling into the hush like a stone sinking into a quiet lake. He held that hand a little longer, as if hoping the warmth might return, as if he could somehow call him back across whatever distant shore he had crossed it. Slowly, Harris straightened, each vertebra aligning like an old tree withering one more storm. His hands fell to his sides, fingers twitching once before finding their quiet stillness. His head lifted, chin firm, eyes empty yet unbroken, though his body trembled. The set of his jaw declared a man who had given every breath and would carry the weight of this final silence for the rest of his days. In the cell far away, our C-55's laughter erupted suddenly, sharp and ragged, echoing off the bare concrete like the rattle of dry bones. The sound rose and fell, an unhinged melody that twisted into a single final crescendo before snapping into silence. He slumped forward, his forehead hitting the bars with a hollow thud, his breath caught, then stilled, leaving behind an echo as cold and empty as the cell itself. Back in the hospital, Harris stood alone beside Jordan, his gaze roaming the young face that had once lit up every dark room. The finality of that stillness carved deep lines into his face. Each wrinkle a record of nights spent watching over a crib. Each scar a quiet testament to the price of love beyond duty. A quiet breeze slipped through the open window, stirring the edge of the thin blanket, lifting it just slightly before letting it fall again. Harris watched the movement, a small, almost invisible dance, as if the room itself offered one last breath for the boy who had once run laughing through the hallways of their home. He leaned forward, his shadow falling across Jordan's face like a soft veil. His lips parted, and he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, each word etched deep into the quiet like a carving on old stone. We started this together. Now I'll finish it for you. And in that quiet, in that final promise, a question floated through the soft morning light, settling into every space in his heart. When all paths end, who will carry the light into the next dawn? The echo of Harris's final words to his son still hung in the air as the early morning light began to break across the sky. The soft glow pushed gently into the small chapel, washing the walls in a pale, forgiving warmth. Inside there was no grand display of grief, no towering floral arrangements or distant dignitaries, only family, a few old comrades with lines deepened by years of service and the steady, silent company of flickering camp. Jordan's portrait sat at the front of the room, a simple frame that seemed to capture a fleeting boyish joy. The quiet, shuffled steps of Harris as he approached the portrait carried the weight of 1,000 unsent letters. Every silent night, when he had watched Jordan sleep as a child, counting each breath like a prayer, He dared not speak aloud. In the far corner, a woman with hair graying at the temples held a folded flag to her chest, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once, lips trembling with the memory of a last phone call that had ended with static instead of words. Outside, a group of young officers stood, their uniforms crisp, but their eyes clouded by a haze of unspoken apologies to a man they had never truly known but claimed to honor. Among them, a young recruit held a candle that dripped wax onto his bare hand. Yet, he refused to flinch, his gaze locked on the door, as if expecting Jordan to walk in at any moment and tell them all it was just another drill. Near the entrance, an elderly man in a faded marine jacket adjusted the medals pinned to his chest, each one reflecting not pride, but a ledger of loss he could no longer balance. His hands shook as he wiped away an imagined smudge from the bronze star, the same star that had once been awarded to a man, now forgotten by the very town that had paraded him down Main Street decades ago. In that same town, a councilman stood on the steps of City Hall that morning making a shallow speech about sacrifice and unity, his words swallowed by the restless wind and jeered at by a small gathering of protesters who held up photos of Jordan with headlines screaming betrayal, their chants weaving into the air like smoke from a dying fire. A cafe downtown had scribbled, "Heroes eat free" on its chalkboard sign, yet the waitress whispered behind the counter that these so-called heroes were nothing but reckless pawns, and a man at the window spat into his cup when he heard her, his face tight with contempt, but his voice too small to challenge hers. Meanwhile, in the schoolyard, a group of children gathered around a tablet, showing footage of Jordan's final mission, their laughter sharp, their fingers pointing at the freeze frame of his last salute, unaware that they were mocking a man who had given them the freedom to jeer without fear. In the grocery store, a woman wearing a bright floral dress knocked over a display of canned soup as she ranted about taxpayers' money funding pointless wars, her words splashing across the tile floor along with the cans, a sharp metallic symphony that no one stopped to clean up, shoppers stepping around the mess as if it were an ordinary stain on an ordinary day. Inside the chapel, Harris's breath faltered as he knelt, one knee pressing into the cold floor, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame as though it were the cheek of his son he longed to feel one last time. The candles flickered, their shadows stretching like solemn dancers against the walls, echoing the rhythm of a heart learning to beat without a piece of itself. The old comrades stood behind Harris, their silence not an absence, but a vigil, each man and woman holding in their chest stories too jagged to share, each breath a reluctant confession to ghosts only they could see. One of them, a woman with a scar trailing down her jawline like a lightning strike, closed her eyes and touched the pocket where she kept a crumpled letter from Jordan. A letter she had never answered, its words now an unanswered call echoing in the hollow of her ribs. Another, a towering figure with a spine bent from too many jumps into too many nameless nights, watched Harris with eyes that had once memorized enemy movements and now could not track the tremor in an old friend's hand. In the hallway beyond the chapel, the quiet was punctuated by the muted sob of a child, a boy too young to understand why his uncle would never again lift him onto strong shoulders, or why his father stood so still, as if rooted to the earth by grief alone. A woman knelt beside the boy, her hand on his back, her mouth forming words he could not hear over the roaring silence in his head. Outside, the dawn pressed further into the world, draping rooftops and cracked sidewalks in a tentative gold, a light too gentle to erase the night, but bright enough to remind them all of its departure. The protesters at City Hall began to disperse, their signs drooping in tired arms, their voices fading into the hush of morning traffic and the scrape of shoes on pavement. In the grocery store, a clerk finally picked up the scattered cans, her fingers sticky with tomato paste, her breath heavy with the scent of resignation. In the schoolyard, the children ran toward the swings, leaving the tablet in the dirt, its screen now reflecting the sky instead of a man's final moments. Back in the cafe, the waitress wiped down tables in a rush, her whispers swallowed by the clink of coffee cups and the low hum of an espresso machine that sounded like a distant helicopter rotor. In the chapel, Harris stood slowly, as though carrying the weight of each whispered apology, and each careless insult thrown into the wind beyond these walls. He laid a trembling hand against the photograph, his thumb resting on the curve of Jordan's cheek. A silent benediction from a father to a son. He could not shield from a world that chose spectacle over understanding, noise over reverence. His other hand clenched and unclenched, the skin white around his knuckles, a silent rhythm of words that would never find voice. The candles flared once, their flames bending as if bowing in a final salute. Harris closed his eyes, the air around him heavy with the scent of melted wax and the unspoken prayers of those who had chosen to stay. The photograph, lit from one side by the trembling flames, showed half his face glowing bright, and the other, half resting in a tender shadow as though he were caught between two worlds. Harris stood before it, his broad shoulders drawn in as though carrying an invisible crushing weight. He took in a long breath, the air rattling gently through lungs tired from too many battles, too many nights awake with ghosts for company. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, each word shaped like a stone turned over countless times in trembling hands. Justice is not a word, he began, the syllables stumbling over each other like tired soldiers. It's a lifetime debt. A hush settled over the room, each person leaning forward as though to catch the words before they fell and shattered. The flames of the candles swayed softly, casting long, thin shadows that danced across the walls in a mournful, gentle rhythm. Near the entrance, a young officer in a dress uniform clenched his fists at his sides, his eyes locked on Harris's bowed head. Outside, a reporter shoved a microphone toward a grieving mother who had not yet spoken to anyone, her tears gleaming under the harsh lens light as the reporter whispered questions meant to peel open wounds for public consumption, her lips quivering but refusing to give them the satisfaction of sound. Down the street, a local politician gave a live interview, standing confidently beside a banner proclaiming unity above all, his smile wide and empty, as he insisted on loyalty and sacrifice, while ignoring the small crowd of veterans behind him, holding hand-painted signs reading, "Stop using our dead for votes," their faces flushed with the reek of betrayal that no slogan could soothe. In a coffee shop nearby, a woman in a sharp blazer laughed sharply as she scrolled past a headline about the service, her fingers tapping out a comment, calling them fools in fatigues, unaware of the young barista listening with a trembling jaw, each word lodging in his chest like shrapnel he could not remove. Further down in a school auditorium were students, gathered for an assembly on civic pride, a guest speaker, oblivious to the undercurrent of grief in the community, launched into a speech about bravery, his voice booming as he described valor in abstract colors, while a teenage girl in the back row clutched a folded letter from her brother and felt her world tilt under the weight of slogans that offered no shelter. Back in the room, an old woman reached into her purse and touched a dog tag resting at the bottom, her thumb brushing the cold metal as though it might warm under her touch and pulse with life again. The man beside her closed his eyes, a tremor running from his jaw down to the stiff edge of his pressed slacks, his fingers tapping a silent code only he and the ghosts of old friends could understand. Harris's eyes lifted for a moment, catching the light of the candles, and in that fleeting second, his face was a map of trenches, deep lines where laughter once lived, scars where love had laid siege, and valleys where sorrow had pulled and hardened into something that no touch could soften. The hush deepened, each breath in the room slow and careful as though the air itself might break. A young woman standing by the far wall pressed her back against the plaster, her lips parting as if she meant to speak, but finding no words left in the cavern of her chest. Outside, traffic moved sluggishly, car horns rising and falling like distant cries across a battlefield, each impatient note to remind her that the world beyond these walls did not pause, did not bow, did not understand. A stray dog sat by the curb, its fur matted and eyes bright, staring toward the chapel doors as though waiting for someone it had once known to emerge and call its name. In the gathering light beyond the windows, a teenage boy filmed himself, his voice mocking as he narrated a parody of the ceremony for his followers. Unaware of the tears streaming down his younger brother's face beside him, a boy who had once traced the lines of a uniform patch and whispered dreams of belonging. Harris's hands rose slowly, trembling as they hovered above the photograph before him, each finger carrying the memory of every night he had stood in a doorway, listening for the gentle shift of a son's breathing. A draft slipped through the room, teasing the flames into flickers that bent and stretched, as though they too strained to hear the echo of a promise made long ago in a hospital room where a newborn cried under harsh fluorescent light. An older man in the second row shifted forward, his breath catching as his gaze locked on Harris, the echo of past commands and radio calls threading silently between them. Across the street, a large screen replayed highlights of a football game. The crowds were spilling from open bar windows, drowning out the quiet hymns rising inside. A current of noise washing over everything fragile and leaving it shivering in its wake. The chaplain, standing by the altar, lowered his eyes to a small, leather-bound book, his fingers tightening around it as though it might fly from his grasp and reveal the words he feared most. The candles leaned forward once more, flames thinning as if bowing in collective reverence or resignation. Harris's shoulders rose and fell, each movement a silent battle against the gravity of loss that pulled at his bones, that threatened to buckle his knees and draw him down into a grief he could no longer outrun. A single tear slipped down his weathered cheek, catching the candle light and a shimmer that vanished as it touched his collar. In the back, one man, an old friend from the Delta days, lowered his head, his callous hand moving to his chest as though steadying something fragile inside. Harris's gaze fell to the photograph, his eyes tracing the familiar curve of his son's smile, the soft lines that had once framed every laugh, every hopeful question. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he reached out and placed his palm against the glass. The contact felt cold at first, then warmed under the silent promise pressing through his skin. His lips parted, and for a moment, no sound emerged. Then, in a breath that felt like breaking open a sealed wound, he spoke. "I failed to protect you here, but I'll protect others for you." His words floated into the space between him and the portrait, resting lightly before settling into the hearts around him. Beyond the chapel doors, the street had already begun to gather a restless crowd, each figure bent beneath the early light that slid across the pavement like a cautious hand. A television crew pushed through with bright mix and impatient questions. One reporter shoving a mother aside as she cradled a folded flag, her eyes wide with grief that no camera could capture without distorting it into spectacle. Near the steps, a man in an immaculate suit scrolled quickly through prepared statements on his phone, his polished shoes shifting on the stone as he rehearsed words about sacrifice and valor, words he would later repeat in a conference room where the air smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Behind him, a young woman clutched a cardboard sign reading, "No more names," her voice from chanting all night, her fingers raw from gripping the edges. Each letter trembling with the fury of someone who had watched too many coffins pass in quiet parades that the city claimed to celebrate, but secretly resented for disrupting morning traffic. Further down, a cafe owner taped a handwritten note to his window, "Closed for the day. Respect our heroes." Yet inside, a barista hissed to her coworker that soldiers were just puppets. Her words slicing the warm air, a sharp echo that bounced between steaming milk pitchers and the tired sighs of customers waiting for something stronger than caffeine to wake them. As the white man walked away in a nearby alley, a boy painted over a mural that had once shown a soldier's silhouette beneath a sunrise, each stroke of black paint erasing the quiet pride of neighbors who had gathered to watch its creation. Their applause now a memory lost beneath fresh graffiti that read, "Feed the rich war machine." On the chapel steps, an old veteran in a weather-beaten jacket handed out small flags to children too young to understand the weight of cloth folded just so, his hands trembling as he fumbled with each edge, eyes flickering up to the sky, as though searching for the friend he had promised never to leave behind on foreign soil. Inside, the candles flickered, as though drawing breath from the gathered sorrow, their light shivering against polished wood and silent pews. A woman in a dark shawl pressed a rosary to her lips, each bead sliding like water through fingers that had once braided her son's hair before he left for boot camp, his laughter still echoing in the empty kitchen where she set to plates long after he stopped coming home. In the back row, a teacher dabbed her eyes with a folded program, the corners smudged with ink and tears, her mind drifting to the boy who had sat in her classroom window seat, sketching small heroes on lined paper when he should have been memorizing state capitals. She remembered the day he stood and said he wanted to serve, his voice steady despite the tremor in his pencil-thin arms. A vow that had sent a ripple of pride and dread across her soul like a stone skipping over dark water. Closer to the altar, a young man clutched a service cap to his chest, his thumb brushing a frayed seam, worn thin by too many silent nights, waiting for calls that never came, his breath tight beneath his ribs as he watched Harris's hand linger against the glass. Outside, the cafe's windows reflected the swelling street crowd, each face turned not toward the sunrise, but toward the screens held aloft. Screens broadcasting the ceremony as a headline ticker below twisted words into shards, each fragment selling outrage or pity in quick bursts of digital applause. A man in a truck revved his engine as he passed, leaning out to spit curses at the protesters on the sidewalk, his voice shredding the quiet morning air, unaware of the boy in the passenger seat beside him, eyes wide and mouth small, learning with each rev how loudly hate can echo. Nearby, a shopkeeper swept broken glass from a window shatter during the night, her broom moving in quiet arcs, head bent low as she listened to the broadcast from a small radio perched on a shelf, the announcer's voice cheerful and thin as he promised exclusive interviews with heroes' families, each syllable cutting deeper than any blade. Back in the chapel, the old veteran shifted from foot to foot, the small flags gone now, his pockets empty, and his hands raw from gripping the railing too tightly. Each breath and effort to hold upright, the ghosts pressing at his spine. A hush washed over the room as Harris's words settled, the candles bending low as though in prayer, the wooden floor beneath him groaning softly like a tired lung. His eyes closed, lash shimmering against weathered cheeks, his breath slipping between cracked lips and slow measured waves. Behind him, the pews creaked under the collective weight of grief and memory, each figure suspended between wanting to reach forward and the knowledge that some distances can never be crossed, no matter how many prayers are whispered into trembling palms. Harris's fingers curled slowly against the glass, his thumb brushing the line of his son's jaw, a gesture more tender than any sermon, more final than any folded flag. The photograph shimmered briefly in the candle light, the smile inside caught halfway between a boy's mischief and a man's resolve, an echo of a life that had burned to bright and to fast, leaving behind the quiet hush of a room trying to remember how to breathe. His words floated into the space between him and the portrait, resting lightly before settling into the hearts around him. A gentle breeze slipped through a narrow window, drifting among the candles. The flames trembled, bending low as though bowing to the weight of his vow, but they did not go out. Their stubborn flickering glow filled the room with a quiet defiance, a small, unwavering testament to a life now carried forward by others. Beside Harris, a grizzled veteran stepped forward, the creases of his uniform echoing years of battle and brotherhood. He laid a hand on Harris's shoulder, the weight steady, grounding. His voice, though husky with age and grief, held a firm resolve. "We fight on for him." Harris turned slightly, his gaze meeting the veteran's. In that shared look, decades of unspoken promises passed between them, each man standing as a monument to every life they had sworn to shield. Outside, the city hummed with restless noise, but beneath that hum, a thin thread of tension ran sharp and bright. On a nearby street corner, a young protester with a painted face threw a bottle toward a line of riot police, the glass shattering mid-arch, fragments scattering like a constellation of lost hopes under street lights. A businessman in a sleek suit stood nearby filming the moment on his phone, his caption ready to twist the act into a weapon against the marchers, unaware that his firm had quietly funded the contracts feeding the unrest he now commodified for clicks. Farther down, a woman in a red scarf screamed at a reporter, her voice shrill and raw as she demanded to know why her brother's name was left off the memorial wall. Her words echoing against the courthouse steps while passers-by pulled out their phones, some jeering, others recording in gleeful detachment as though witnessing a staged tragedy for late-night entertainment. In a diner across from the square, a man in a white apron watched the unfolding chaos on a mounted television, his lips curling as he muttered that soldiers were just pawns, unaware of the young dishwasher standing behind him, a gold star pinned beneath his sleeve, each word crashing into his ribs like silent bullets. Back in the chapel, the air thickened with a hush so profound that even the smallest shiver of a flame felt like thunder rolling across distant hill. The veteran's hand remained firm on Harris's shoulder, an anchor amid waves of memory and loss, his fingers pressing down, not in comfort, but in a shared understanding of a debt never paid in full. A tear slipped from the corner of a woman's eye in the front pew, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles shone white, her head bowed over a folded flag that smelled faintly of gun oil and salt, each crease a silent story no headline would ever chase. Another man behind her drew a sharp breath, his thumb rubbing endlessly over a wedding band. His eyes locked on the portrait at the altar as if trying to memorize every curve, every shadow, before it too slipped into the fog of all the faces he had already lost. A priest stood to the side, his lips moving in a prayer too soft to catch, his eyes flickering toward the door, as though expecting the outside world to invade at any moment with its shouting, its judgment, its need to reduce every tear to a slogan. The candles flared briefly, casting long, wavering silhouettes on the wall, their movement weaving together the living and the departed into a tapestry only they could truly read. The veteran leaned closer, his breath catching for a moment, his heart tattooing beneath metals that felt heavier than armor. Each one a chapter he carried in his bones, each clang on his chest a reminder of every brother who had not returned to lift a glass or a burden. Harris stood motionless, his spine straight, yet quivering beneath invisible blows, his chest rising and falling with the slow precision of someone measuring each breath as a prayer and a confession. Somewhere beyond the windows, the city sirens rose in a distant broken chorus, their wails slicing across the morning like a blade through silk, a grim metronome to the restless pulse of a nation divided by noise and blurred line. Arissa's fingers twitched near his side, the small movement echoing battles fought not on foreign soil, but in quiet kitchens and empty hallways, places where silence settled like dust on an unused uniform. The candles bent again, light pooling and small golden licks across the polished floor, each ripple a silent hymn to those who remained unseen, unheard, unthanked. Harris's lips parted as if to speak, but closed again, his throat tightening with words too sacred to surrender to the air. In that pause, every life he had touched, every promise he had whispered over sleeping heads, seemed to rise and hover in the thick, trembling hush. The veteran squeezed his shoulder once more, a final seal to the vow they both carried, the echo of old missions, and whispered farewells stitching itself into the quiet spaces between their ribs. Harris gave a small, solemn nod. His eyes were dry now, yet they held a brittle shimmer, a final fragile spark refusing to be extinguished. As the morning light grew stronger, it filled the small chapel, brushing softly across Jordan's portrait. The boy's image seemed to shift gently in the new day's glow, the smile more certain, the shadows softer. For a fleeting moment, it looked as though Jordan were smiling directly at his father. A quiet knowing curve at the edge of his lips, a silent promise whispered from beyond. Reese stepped back slightly, his hand falling to his side. He stood tall, his back straight despite the tremor running down his spine. His breath came slowly, each exhale a quiet release, each inhale a new vow drawn into his bones. He turned his head upward, his eyes tracing the brightening sky beyond the narrow window. The pale blue crept forward, washing away the last hold of night, each ray unfolding like a banner across the heavens. Harris's lips moved once more, the words forming carefully, shaped by every loss, every promise, every final goodbye. Justice will echo longer than any bullet. And in that final hushed moment, as the dawn slipped fully into the room, the question remained in the silence, resting gently on every shoulder. Who among us will carry the echo forward when the last candle flickers?